Hi everyone. I think we're ready for the first panel to kick in. My name is Papuashvili. I work for International Partnership for Human Rights, which is a Brussels-based non-governmental organization working in Eastern Europe, South Caucasus, and Central Asia. And I have an honor to moderate this first panel. We have fantastic speakers joining us to cover different aspects of transnational repression and how it affects journalists. But I would like to kickstart with some introductory words to kind of set the ground. And I'll start by thanking the organizers for convening the second UK Media Forum. It's my first time to participate, and I'm excited to what's going to come in the coming 2 days. In terms of the context, when we talk about transnational repression, there are a number of broad factors that we have to take into consideration before we go into some specifics. And those factors include the fact that rules-based international order is in crisis today, and that the democracy is in retreat globally. And in relation to those factors, we see also that impunity is rife. And we see that more and more authoritarian governments feel free to engage in certain unlawful behavior, including going after their nationals or third country nationals beyond their territorial boundaries. This is something that we call, broadly speaking, transnational repression, when a government uses different methods to persecute its nationals mostly, but sometimes also third country nationals. Primary targets of transnational repression very often are media workers, journalists, but also human rights defenders, as well as political activists, who are often forced out from their countries of residence or from their home countries in relation to their professional work. So we can already say that transnational repression is a systemic and global pattern. It's not just some isolated cases that we see here and there. This is really emerging as a threat, and unfortunately, we see increasing number of cases of persecution of journalists and other groups that I have mentioned. Methods of repression often include harassment and surveillance, legal persecution, including abusive criminal charges, extradition requests, Interpol notices, etc. We also see new forms of transnational repression emerge. For example, in relation to Russia, we see more and more cases of pressure on families of those who have fled the country. Also, we see that digital persecution tools, including digital surveillance, are becoming more and more widespread and sophisticated and hard to contain. This type of repression obviously has huge impact on media workers, on journalists, and unfortunately, being in exile is no longer a guarantee for safety for them. But also, more broadly speaking, transnational repression has a broader impact on democratic societies, as it undermines press freedom globally, it erodes democratic space in host countries where exiled individuals live, and it threatens principles of free speech for persecuted individuals, more broadly speaking. There is an increasing awareness of this problem, nationally and internationally, and we see that there are institutional responses, policy responses that are being deployed. However, we see that these responses are far from being adequate. There are a lot of gaps that remain legally and on the level of practice, but also on the level of resources. And those gaps need to be filled as a matter of urgency. The goal of our panel is threefold. First of all, we will have some speakers in the panel who will share first-hand experience of repression, also included. We will also examine tools used by authoritarian governments more closely to see what exactly those patterns are, and then we will discuss practical protection steps for journalists and media freedom. I think it's enough for the introduction, and I would like to open now floor for our distinguished panelists, first of whom is Alsu Urmashaeva, who is a Russian-American journalist. Also, probably your case has become, or you have become rather, better known personality after you have been arrested by the Russian government in 2023, when you went back home, and this arrest was related to your public stance in relation to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Perhaps you could tell us more about this particular experience, but also about transnational repression from your perspective as a survivor of this crime. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I'll start this with saying how happy I am to be here. And this is literally, I mean it. I'm happy to be free. I'm happy to be in London. I'm happy to be safe. And we have more than 50 journalists behind bars in Russia these days. Half of them are Ukrainian journalists. And one of them is my colleague from Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, Nika Novak. I'll talk about her and share her poetry later, because this is very important that to hear from behind bars what is happening. But a couple of words about myself. We journalists, we never want to be in the spotlight. We never want to be a story. We want to be behind the stories that we cover. And what happened to me was also a very intimidating, a very horrific experience I wish I never had. I traveled to Kazan, my native city, where I wasn't born, by the way, but I grew up. I was born in Soviet Union in Kazakhstan. I'm ethnic Tatar, and my family moved to Tatarstan. And it was in 2023. It was a battle between my mind and soul. I knew that I was working for Radio Free Europe, who had been covering the war in Ukraine. And I was a co-editor of a book, Saying No to War, where we told the stories of 40 people in regional Russia, in the Volga region of Russia, people who opposed the war the first weeks of the invasion. Right now, we are in the year 2026, and it's even impossible to imagine. This is how much the situation has changed since then in Russia, that somebody would even dare to say something against the war, because it's a criminal case, it's fear, it's harassment against the families. At that time, that journalistic feeling and experience of mine told me that we have to document what was happening at that time, when the whole world here in the West was thinking that why the Russians are not protesting, that well, why they don't go out to the streets. This is how we showed why they don't. They tried, and then they were jailed. So that, as I mentioned, it was very hard for me to decide, but my mom needed my care, she needed medication, she needed to be taken to the doctors, and this is the only thing what a daughter can do for her loved mom, and I traveled there. I was stopped at the airport on the way back to Prague, and my documents were confiscated. I have an American and Russian passport. And I was told very politely that I would be able to travel back to Prague within a couple of days after this paperwork was sorted out. Those couple of days lasted for 5 months of fear and uncertainty under house arrest. I didn't know what was happening. I was ready for everything, but not to prison. And why I'm telling you all those details, it's important to know how those governments, those authorities intimidate journalists. They stop you from traveling, they stop you from working first. They don't put you to jail immediately. By that, they try to intimidate you and your colleagues to stop doing what you are doing. And that's the important moment where journalists need support and they need help. And they need attention, media attention, and attention from their colleagues. 288 horrific days followed in prison in Kazan. I won't give you any details about the conditions because right now there are more people behind bars who are in those conditions, and the only thing how we can help them is to keep their names in the spotlight right here. I'm the lucky one. The miracle happened, and I was exchanged in the biggest prisoner exchange since the Cold War in 2024, August 1st. I was greeted by President Biden in the US, and I was part of the exchange where the West made a very difficult choice. The West, and there was multiple countries were involved. I'm sure you've heard about that exchange, where we journalists were exchanged to real criminals. And this is how we showed, and the exchange was criticized, you know that. But we in the West showed our real values. We showed that human life matters, that reuniting a mother with her children and family and colleagues, this is what matters. Since I got back, I needed some time to improve my health because it was a very dangerous experience there. And then after thinking what I was doing next, it came natural. It was around the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays that I was walking along the streets of Prague and Christmas markets were on already. Suddenly I remembered a letter I got in prison, while I was in prison. A lady who lived in one of European cities, and I must tell you, I never knew because of security reasons where people were writing me from. I could figure out from the stamps, I could figure out from the postcards. So I realized she was in one of the European cities. She wrote to me, "Dear Alsu, I'm here with my friends celebrating, I don't remember what exactly was around the holidays. And I'm thinking about you. I stepped outside of the party room right now, and I took my time to write that I'm thinking about you, and we're talking about you here, and we'll be so happy when you are released, because you will be released." And I remember those days, dark December days, very cold in the prison cell. My pen was freezing while writing. There was no hot water, and I had to literally warm up water to brush my teeth. And I'll be honest, sometimes I didn't do that. I didn't brush my teeth, and it was done on purpose by the prison authority so we lose the dignity. The prisoners lose the dignity. They don't want to hope. They lose hope. And at that moment, when a postcard like that is delivered to the cell room, the world shines up. There is a sunshine where there is no sunshine. There is a window when there is no window. And I remembered that, and I started writing letters and postcards to journalists in Russian prisons. When some people say that it's like Gulag times there in Russia, to a certain point, yes, but there is a big difference. There is connection with them. Very limited, yes, but there is contact. We know how they are there, and they know what we are doing here. For example, I'm going to talk today about the mentioned Nika Novak. She had been in prison it's been 3 Christmases already that she spent in Siberia. she's trying to fight injustice in prison. As a journalist, she can't stay indifferent to things that she thinks she wants to change in prison. I'm very worried about her well-being. I really want her to be released in good health, and I'm trying to support her. I'm trying to support her by keeping her name in the spotlight, because this is how my release was possible. My release, my exchange was possible only thanks to people like you in this room, who raised my case at every possible opportunity, on every possible public forum. And it was a very big effort by the US government, the Czech government, and other European governments, and international media organizations. We have another journalist in Azerbaijan these days, Farid Mirhalizadeh, who will be in a courtroom tomorrow appealing his sentence, which is 9 years. He's an economist. The only crime of his is that he was reporting on economic situation in Azerbaijan. This is what Radio Free Europe does. We speak more than 20 languages. We work in more than 20 countries, where we bring that essential lifeline information for people to make their choices, whether it's giving them information on their local elections, or even, you know what, like happening right now, for example, there are missile attacks on Russian regions, and people, the audiences, they don't trust their local media channels. They turn to Radio Free Europe's regional sources, regional channels, media channels, to verify the information, if they can trust media channels. This is what we do. And Farid Mirhalizadeh was doing the same thing, and he has been sentenced to 9 years in prison. I think in the worst case is our third journalist, who is in prison right now, as Reza in Iran. He is in Iran prison, and as far as we know from public sources, the prison administration abandoned the Iran prison, and they have been left, the prisoners have been left under the control of Iranian special forces. They are denied food and water. That's very alarming, and Reza Valizadeh had been there more than 600 years. He's a former colleague of mine from the Iranian service called Farda. He traveled again. He's an American Iranian journalist. He traveled to Tehran to take care of his family. This is, when we speak about transnational repressions, these are very clear examples how those authorities, those governments, work with people, and they use different ways, not only physical abuse, but that psychological pressure and moral abuse. Many journalists, since the invasion of Ukraine started, many journalists moved into exile. Living in exile doesn't mean that journalists are safe. As you mentioned, their families have been intimidated and many interrogated, and they can't see them, they can't help them. This is, again, this is another tool that the governments, and we are talking about here about the governments who use the same playbook. It's the feeling that they just sit down and have the calls every night and morning and night, say, hey, what have you done? Let's do the same thing because it worked here. Well, it works in their terms, but we also share here what works in our case, in our cases here in the free world. Another thing that about support, I mentioned letters, it's also supporting your local media organizations and local and international press freedom organization. And it's not only, yes, donating, that money will go to a very good cause, but also surround yourself with like-minded people, build a community, or join the community where you can have an impact. This is very important for journalism, and I'm so thankful that this media forum is happening here at the university, because since I announced that I'll be here, I was reached out by many students here, where I'll be happy to sit down and talk about the future of journalism. Yes, journalism is a dangerous profession, but it is a very, very needed one right now, and we need to be safe, we need to be secure, and we need to support each other. That's when we in difficult times, it is really important to be part of the community. I'm happy to answer any questions or to talk more about my experience or the cases of our imprisoned journalists, because there is very much to talk to. I'm also looking forward to hear from other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for sharing your story. Most important is that, you know, you're free now, you're with us, you are safe, and I hope it will stay that way, and you will be able to continue your important journalistic work. Our next speaker is Michaela Wrong. Michaela is a British journalist, author, who spends much of her career reporting on politics, conflicts, and governance in Africa. Michaela is going to talk about transnational repression in Africa's Great Lakes region, and she's also going to touch upon issues like internet shutdowns, use of spyware, and use of disinformation networks in AI-driven propaganda. This is quite a lot to unpack, Michaela, but I would really invite you to keep your intervention short, I don't know, up to 5 minutes, so that we have time for other speakers as well as for Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, I think that's probably impossible, but I'll do my best. Yes, I've written a series of books, non-fiction books, and also a novel about Africa, about the Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes and Eastern Africa. And my last one was about Rwanda, and it was not a book that sort of fitted into the general narrative at the time of how the world saw Rwanda. It was very confrontational. It basically spoke about the extraterritorial assassination campaign run by the government of Paul Kagame beyond Rwandan borders, against mostly people who he had once been very close to, his former head of the armed forces, his former head of intelligence, his former ruling party general secretary. So this had been going on for a long time. It wasn't something that Rwandan journalists were going to be writing about themselves. I knew when I wrote the book and published it that I also was going to become a target, because there was a long-established tradition of very tight control of journalists in Rwanda. And sure enough, I mean, the last, so it came out in 2021, the last 5 years, I've experienced what it's like to be a target on social media. And I think this is something that people often forget, that sometimes there's an assumption, a very foolish assumption made, that in Africa, you know, social media maybe isn't such a big thing, use of the internet's not such a big thing. These are governments that don't know how to play with it in the way that we see governments like the government of Iran or Russia manipulating and dominating and using those tools. This is completely erroneous. One of the points I always make to people when talking about President Paul Kagame is that his upbringing as a young rebel, he's now in his 60s, his upbringing as a young rebel was in information, military intelligence. He trained in Tanzania, and he was always someone who was known when he became the head of the armed forces for listening in on the radios of his soldiers. So he is someone who completely understands the importance of information disinformation and manipulating and using a narrative. And in Rwanda's case, the narrative has been, there are echoes here with another part of the world, the narrative has been, you know, my country was nearly wiped out, my society was nearly wiped out during the genocide, how dare you criticize us, and we face imminent extermination at any moment, and therefore we always have the moral high ground. So people like me, who then write a book criticizing that kind of government, you immediately get accused of being a genocide denier, which is actually against the law in Rwanda. And so if I were to set foot in Rwanda, I could be prosecuted and go to jail for quite a long time. There have also been attempts by Rwanda to get genocide denial. That is actually a crime in the European Union. It's not one that is ever prosecuted, but it is a crime, so in theory I could also be accused of this crime and arrested if I go to France or Brussels. I have to say this doesn't really bother me too much, since I am very clear in my mind that I have never once denied that there was a genocide in Rwanda. I actually covered it as a journalist for Reuters and BBC, so why would I deny it? So Rwanda has a Twitter army. I would also make the point that Ethiopia, another huge African country, is very clever in the way it manipulates the narrative. These are another country that was run by someone, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who was trained in military intelligence, so understands the importance of communication, messaging, controlling the message. Both Rwanda and Ethiopia, as it happens, are known to be consumers and clients of Pegasus spyware and other spywares, because if a government has bought spyware in the past from the kind of companies that sell those products, they're going to buy the updated versions and the new versions. So that has a very big impact if you're a journalist trying to report on those parts of the world. And in fact, I always say to people now, I mean, I know diplomats I know who go to Rwanda or to do their work will take a burner phone and will not take their normal phones, because the spyware that is used by Rwanda is simply used, you know, and it's been applied to diplomats, journalists, politicians, military chiefs, NGOs, presidents who happen to go through Rwanda, that you get all the contents of your phone hoovered up, and then very useful information for the intelligence services of those countries. So these are very sophisticated players, and they're, you know, I think one has to accept that in many African countries today, in the parts of the world I've worked in, there is no such thing as independent journalism. It simply doesn't exist. It can't, not in the circumstances described. We know in countries like Rwanda the role in which the fact that there was no independent journalism in the run-up to the 1994 genocide under President Juvenal Habyarimana. There is no independent journalism now under Paul Kagame. So the role that the journalism can play in allaying ethnic tension, not heightening it, not exacerbating it, not indulging hate speech, it can do the opposite, but it can also be a brake against it. That's just, you know, if you're operating in Rwanda now, today, you are going to be a pro-government journalist. That's the only way you can operate, and if you don't, you'll be in jail. Or you'll come to a sticky end for no apparent reason. There's so many issues of this that I could talk about. One of them is, I think we should bear in mind here, and this will be true for many of the other speakers, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. This kind of disinformation war, this manipulation of narratives, is often actively supported in the West here, in universities like City, at universities down the road like SOAS, by academics who are sympathetic to the regimes in question, who, you know, I think it was Lenin who coined that lovely phrase, useful idiots. and they no doubt think they're doing well. Some of them are probably also on the payroll of the governments, the repressive governments in question, but they play their role by alerting local embassies, the embassies that all have intelligence agents here in London who are surveying the student bodies from their countries, but are also surveying Western writers who dare to comment on their countries and reporting back on what they are up to. And often what you will find is the useful idiots who should know better, who are professors, authors, writers, people working, MPs here, people working for NGOs will be cheering those efforts on, cheering that narrative on. I speak with a certain bitterness because when I started promoting my book, I found that not only was I being target with the most vicious onslaught on Twitter of personalized abuse as a racist, as a genocide denier, as a whore, as someone who had slept with my sources, but also attempts were physically made to prevent my meetings and my encounters, my promotional events, my discussions, events like this. Physical events, attempts were made to stop them happening in Brussels, in South Africa, and in New Zealand. So the reach of these small countries which have embassies around the world and the way they use those embassies is often overlooked. Anyway, I'm up at the end of my time, very happy to talk about all these in these issues at greater length.
Thank you very much, Michaela, for bringing Africa perspective into our discussion. Let me now turn to Keelan Gallagher, whom you already met. Keelan, you're a practitioner, legal practitioner who helps journalists, including the ones who are facing transnational repression. So I think audience will be very much interested in hearing your perspective as a legal practitioner on this.
Thanks very much. I'm acutely conscious that we're a big panel and there's lots of people in the room who have expertise on this, so I'll keep it short. I wanted to highlight just 5 trends that I tend to see, and I'm going to use particular reference. I'm going to refer particularly to Iran and Hong Kong. Just given the time available, I'll just use those 2 examples, but these are trends I tend to see more broadly. It's worth saying, of course, that transnational repression against people who are critics of governments abroad is not new. You know, we all know many decades ago about the poison-tipped umbrella here in London, you know, the fatwa on Salman Rushdie. So it's not new to have an autocratic regime thinking, not only am I going to try to silence people within my borders, but I'm going to use the powers that I have available and methods I have available to try to silence people wherever in the world they may be. We've seen it for a long time against individual, high-profile dissidents abroad. What I think is different now is the sheer scale, the industrialization of it, and the fact that we're starting to see it not just against 1 or 2 individuals like Salman Rushdie or a particular person, but we're starting to see it against entire media organizations and against huge swathes of journalists. So it's a very different thing that we're now seeing, but obviously the original core of it is not new. We, of course, now live in a world in which Saudi Arabia can order the dismembering of a journalist in a Council of Europe country. Jamal Khashoggi was in Turkey when that happened to him in 2018. Russia poisons its critics in Salisbury and London. Journalists can be forcibly brought within jurisdiction, as we saw Belarus do by hijacking a Ryanair plane. Shadow Chinese police stations can operate to terrorize diaspora communities, including here on the streets of London. And very important what Michaela said about the useful idiots, because of course we do see through things like Confucius Institutes, messaging going out to have a chilling effect on students and others who might dare to speak out or simply to use social media in a way that's disliked. And we see horrifying cases like those of Ruhollah Azam, a journalist based in France, or Paul Rusesabagina in the US, lured to false meetings, kidnapped and brought back to abusive regimes. Paul Rusesabagina kidnapped in UAE and then brought to Rwanda. You've heard about Rwanda from Michaela. And Ruhollah Azam brought back to Iran and executed in Iran for the crime of being a journalist. despite having lived safely in France. So the 5 tactics I wanted to highlight were these. First of all, what we're increasingly seeing, particularly with Iran, is what I would call a jurisprudential and tactical dragnet. So instead of just going after a small number of high-profile individuals, we're starting to see entire media organisations targeted. So I've worked for many years for the BBC Persian service, and also I've worked for Iran International, and have worked while doing that work with people from Deutsche Welle, Radio Farda and others. So journalists who are reporting on and about Iran, but from around the world. Now, Iran for many years has targeted people within its borders. So my good friend and also his good friend Jason Rezaian, for example, for the crime of being a journalist working for the Washington Post, was of course jailed for 544 days in Iran. We've seen that happening, and we've seen it happening to local journalists for a long time. Iran has now industrialized ways of trying to target those who report on Iran wherever in the world they may be, including here in the UK. The reason I mentioned that kind of idea of it being a dragnet is if you take the BBC Persian service, for example, Iran does not just target the high-profile individual presenters or the people who are investigative journalists reporting on politics. If you work for the BBC Persian service, whether you're behind a screen, never in front of a camera, whether you do arts work or culture work or anything, once you're associated with the entity, you are public enemy number 1. That's what happens. The same thing is happening with Iran International. So simply your association with the media organisation in and of itself means that you're being targeted by Iran. And that's a new trend and a worrying trend. The second one I'd talk about is the range of tactics, the 360-degree range of tactics. BBC Persian and Iran International have both seen, as has Deutsche Welle and Voice of America, the Persian service when it was operating, we saw tactics being used which involved weaponizing family members in country to try to silence journalists out of country. So many of my clients have, for example, received video calls from a family member who has been taken in for questioning by the authorities in Iran. And they are told to make a call, and the journalist then receives a call where the family member will say, they'll let me go if you'll agree to stop being a journalist or you agree to spy for the regime. Now, that is something which routinely is happening. And it means they've got human capital in country who they can try to use to silence the journalist externally. I've got to say, while sitting here in the UK, something that's really important to bear in mind is what I quite often see, unfortunately, is a very good response to these issues from the Foreign Office, from the FCDO, and from UK missions and embassies around the world, but a mismatch between that and immigration policy. So at the same time that you get very strong statements from the UK, for example, at the UN in Geneva, at the Human Rights Council, about how outrageous it is that this is happening, at the same time, those individual journalists will then get a refusal of a visa for their mother to come to London, for example, and a message saying, well, why can't you go to Tehran to see your mother, right? So, I mean, you've this ludicrous mismatch between the policy that we have in relation to media freedom emanating from the FCDO and the policy which is emanating from the Home Office on immigration. So, strong words emanating from the FCDO are not enough. We need to see a whole government response which recognises this for what it is and which enables journalists to do their jobs here. Third thing I want to highlight is the fact that many of the tactics I've seen Iran use in particular are misogynistic and are very targeted at female journalists. I see we've Julie Passetti in the room, who of course has done such brilliant work in her own right and then for UN Women on the targeting of women journalists online, and she's highlighted the case of BBC Persian in her research work. So many women journalists receive particular types of threats. So let me just give you one example. One of my BBC Persian clients was the victim of deepfake pornographic images being produced. And some of those images were then sent to her son's school in London. Now, that's an example of something which is designed to send a chill down the spine of the journalist and to make them think, well, they know where my son goes to school. And also, those kind of misogynistic tactics are particularly damaging when you have people who are living in exile and who don't have easy means of communication with their family members back in Iran. So I've also seen many of my Iranian clients, for example, having fake news put out in state media in Iran, claiming that they've only got their job because of sleeping with their boss, and also many women being described as being lesbian, which is a crime in Iran. So you have these fake news stories which are pushed out in state media and which sometimes family members believe back in country. So that's a particular tactic. Fourth, the gravity of the attacks, really key to highlight this. Many of you will know that my client Puria Zarati from Iran International was stabbed in broad daylight in London on Good Friday over a year ago. Now, Good Friday was chosen quite deliberately because it was a bank holiday and the attackers thought that the response from the police would be slower and more sluggish than it would be on a normal working day. And they were right. So 3 men flew into country, into Heathrow, came in a car over to his home in Richmond, deliberately targeted him at home because, of course, there's much better security at the actual media organisation, but not at his home. And he was stabbed all over the legs and buttocks. And they then went back to Heathrow and flew out of the country before anyone had managed to catch them. Now, that's an example of what is happening in broad daylight here in London to Iranian journalists, simply for the crime of being journalists. We've also seen a similar attack thwarted in Sweden, and you heard from the Minister about the sheer number of attacks which have been thwarted. So it's important to remember the gravity of the attacks and the risks that journalists here in the UK are taking every day to report on and about Iran. And we're having this discussion in a week when reporting on and about Iran could not be more important. And then the fifth theme that I just wanted to turn to very briefly, I wanted to give from Hong Kong just a couple of examples to show the ever-widening circles that we're seeing. Now, sometimes I've seen with transnational repression, some organisations use definitions which assume that it relates only to diaspora communities, and that is not correct. And definitions which refer only to diaspora communities are too narrow, because increasingly what we're starting to see with some regimes is the targeting of other individuals who may support journalists, regardless of what their ethnicity is or what their background is. So with Hong Kong, we've started to see that. So I represent Jimmy Lai, as you know, British national detained in Hong Kong. And what we've seen in Jimmy Lai's case is a targeting of anyone associated with that case, wherever they may be. So his son, Sebastian Lai, for example, accused of committing a criminal offence for daring to speak with me and with my colleagues at the United Nations in Geneva. So very aggressive statements put out by the Hong Kong SAR authorities claiming that we and Sebastian are committing criminal offences by advocating for his father or by me doing my job as an international human rights lawyer. Benedict Rogers, who runs an NGO here in London, accused of committing a criminal offence under the national security law for putting material on his website in London. So it's important to say it's not just diaspora communities. What they're now doing is they're essentially attempting to cut the legs from under any support that someone like Jimmy Lai has. So instead of just going after Hong Kong diaspora, they're also deciding to go after NGOs who are supportive. They're deciding to go after international lawyers who are supportive. This is a new and very, very worrying tactic, and one we have absolutely got to call out. And final thing I'll just say is this. When myself and my team were approached by the UN Secretary General a couple of years ago and asked if we would allow ourselves to be named expressly in the report about being victims of transnational repression from China, we agreed to do it. And the reason was this. I am acutely conscious that when I am targeted as a white middle-class woman based here in Europe, I appreciate it's post-Brexit, it's still Europe. When I'm targeted, I don't have family members in Hong Kong. I don't have family members in mainland China. I don't have family members in Iran or in Saudi Arabia. So when I'm targeted by these regimes, I can call it out. So I do have a privilege which allows me to call it out in a way that many of my other clients do not. And that is useful, because what happens when the UN usually tries to raise transnational repression is the regimes will say, well, you don't have the receipts and we don't agree with this, because the examples given are so anonymised in order to protect people in country. We don't have to be anonymised, and we have the receipts. And that's why myself and my colleagues are speaking out about it. It's why Sebastian Lai is speaking out about what's happening to him, and it's why NGOs who are targeted by Hong Kong and Chinese authorities are speaking out, and why parliamentarians are speaking out about what's happening to them. So it's not about us, we're secondary, but we are able to speak about it in a way that other people are not, and it's really important that we do that, because no longer are regimes satisfied with targeting journalists within their borders. They're now targeting journalists worldwide, wherever they may be, and they're now targeting journalists' support networks, and we have got to call it out and stand up to it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaylin, for outlining the patterns, but also outlining the gaps, including here in the UK. We will probably come back to that in the Q&A, hopefully. Our next two speakers are going to bring multilateral international institutions perspective into the question of transnational repression. So we have representatives from the OSCE and also from the UN, two international organizations that have the mandate to deal with issues like transnational repression. Perhaps we'll start with Aidar Botagarov, who works for the OSCE Office for the Freedom of the Media. Aidar, perhaps you could tell us a little bit more what OSCE is doing to address this growing problem, and whether there are already ongoing processes at the OSCE level in this regard, and also whether you see any gaps in the OSCE response, or whether OSCE could be doing something more in addition to what's already being done. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for having me at the panel today. The topic which we are covering today, discussing it today, is very important also in the context that the Office of the Representative on Freedom of the Media has been looking at from the perspective of exiled journalists, which was already mentioned several times here by the speakers. Since the representative has a mandate to further free independent pluralistic media and also advocate for safety of journalists, this topic of exiled journalists has become very important, especially in the last several years, as we saw that hundreds and hundreds of people with their families were forced to flee their countries. Although exiled journalism is not a new concept, transnational repression is not a new concept, but the multitude of this issue is becoming really and growing really dangerously. The representative is tasked to advocate for safety of journalists, and that's why we are trying to study this phenomenon a bit deeper, meeting with the experts, with journalists, trying to understand what challenge they faced, where the gaps are, and maybe also to advocate for the support measures to exiled journalists in order to continue their work, and to importantly, continue delivering information back home to their audiences, because in some countries, as was also mentioned by previous speakers, there is no independent journalism left. People living in the black holes, although, yeah, of course, we have digital technologies allowing us to access information more broadly, but at the same time, we also should understand that the governments are taking measures, more restrictive measures, in order to set a control of online information. And obviously, the state, the governments, they have more opportunities, more power to do so. And exiled journalists, of course, are in a more precarious conditions when it comes to fighting those restrictions, fighting those threats. They are facing these difficulties online. They are facing them online. We see that the governments use more and more actively overly broad legislation, such as notions like foreign agents, undesirable organizations, extremists and terrorists. And we also see that the governments are very consistent and comprehensive in using this legislation against the critiques, against the dissenting views, because they're not only declaring such people as extremists, but they're also sentencing, imprisoning them in absentia. They are putting them on the wanted lists. They are alerting other states to arrest and extradite journalists and their family members, which of course makes this problem even more bigger and extends the problem beyond the borders. And that's what the transnational repression is. The governments of some countries also restrict their citizens to renew the documents. This is another problem that exiled journalists, for instance, face in the example of Belarus. They cannot go to their consulate and get a new passport. They are forced to come back to the country, and obviously this is not what they're going to do, but then they are in this precarious situation of legal uncertainty. Again, when we say that the governments put a lot of digital efforts to control digital information, this touches upon the very commitment of the organization like OSCE, which is based on the comprehensive security, when the free flow of information is supposed to unite people and make them stronger. But at the same time, we see that the problem is growing, and there are no real solutions to address them. And with this in mind, representative promotes information, raises public awareness among the participating states, first and foremost, in order for them to understand the scale of the problem, in order to understand the challenge that the journalists face, in order to seek some joint solutions and advocate for some support measures. Particularly in this case, these are the exiled journalists, and this is the mandate the representative has. We see a lot of similarities also in the context of addressing the issues and challenges faced by exiled journalists, which are already in place for human rights defenders, for instance, which is a broader group, but at the same time, some of the elements which already exist should probably or can be applicable to protect the journalists in exile. One other thing that I wanted to mention that is, or maybe also repeating myself, that the government, of course, has more power in exerting this transnational repression. For instance, one other tool is to strip exiled journalists from, financial services. And how they do it, they declare people extremists and terrorists, and then circulate information internationally, putting them on the list of anti-money laundering and countering terrorism financing lists. And this is already a red flag for many banks worldwide in order to start raising the questions for the journalists or for foreign nationals living abroad. So to finish maybe my intervention here, I just want to say that the issue is very complex, and as Minister earlier said, that media freedom issue cannot, or challenge to media freedom cannot be tackled by one organization or by one state, but it's rather a joint effort. And here we very much, of course, rely on the expertise of the civil society organizations, of our colleagues from other international organizations like UN. For instance, 2 years ago, UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Opinion and Expression released a very comprehensive, very interesting, and very useful report on the fate of exiled journalists worldwide. And this report covered very, very important challenge that the journalists are facing these days in exile. Our institution also produced a report of last year, where we tried to highlight the challenge that journalists in exile from the OEC region are facing after relocation, where we tried to raise the awareness of the states about these difficulties they are having, legally speaking, administratively, financially, but also, first and foremost, when it comes to the concerns for their safety, because the safety concerns that they have faced home usually follow them abroad. So these are the topics that we are trying to cover, and thank you again very much for inviting me, and it was a very useful exchange, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Aydar. Our next speaker represents UN Office for High Commissioner for Human Rights. And Renaud, your office is increasingly involved in this, on addressing this problem. I have participated in one of the workshops that your office representatives did in Brussels back in December, and it was a wonderful workshop. I think audience will be very eager to know more about what you do to tackle this challenge. Over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me first. And I have to say it's quite difficult, to end this very interesting and rich panel discussion with such strong testimonies from people even affected by transnational repression. But what is clear from all the presentation, I think, is that transnational repression is not anecdotal. It is widely documented. And as it was mentioned by Kylie, this is not a new trend. The scale of it is new. And just to give you some additional figures, additional to what Simon said at the beginning, Freedom House between 2014 and 2024 documented more than 1,200 cases of physical incidents involving 48 origin states in 103 host countries. And just in 2024, Freedom House documented the physical assault by 23 governments involving 160 physical assault involving 23 governments. So the scale is very important. But this is not the only new, I think, element in transnational repression. This physical violence, is not new. But what we see is a combination between physical violence, threats, and new forms of intimidation, like legal harassment, and especially when it comes to legal harassment, the weaponization of a number of laws, national security laws, counterterrorism laws, criminal libel, because we see in many countries that there is still criminalization of libel, but also fake news laws. We see also that in many countries there are legislation which enables the deprivation of nationality, which is also a tool used as a transnational repression tool. And this has to be also combined with SLAPS, and SLAPS will be discussed this afternoon. And I think it is important to make the bridge between this morning panel discussion on transnational repression and the discussions that we will have this afternoon on legal harassment. We see also the use of digital harassment and digital surveillance, which is very, very important. Kylie mentioned online harassment, which is very concerning, the use of doxing, but also pornographic, as it was mentioned, items to denigrate journalists abroad. The misuse of financial systems, commercial pressure, but also, and it was mentioned by many testimonies, the family intimidation back home. What is also striking is that despite those very various tactics, we see that the impacts converge. We see that there is a constant fear among journalists targeted by transnational repression. We see, as it was mentioned, especially by Alsu at the beginning, the psychological harm that affect journalists, and also the disruption of work, education, and sometimes, I think it was mentioned also by you, also healthcare. And also this constant fear, as I mentioned, that a family member back home will be targeted. It is clear also that transnational repression, when it comes more to the legal side, is in clear breach of sovereignty, the sovereignty of states that is guaranteed by the UN Charter. I know it's quite, it's becoming quite maverick to mention the UN Charter nowadays, but it is important to recall that. It is also in clear violations of many international human rights norms, beginning by the rights to life when there are assassination abroad, but also freedom of expression. It's obvious that transnational repression clearly contravenes the right to seek, receive, and impart information, as it is guaranteed by Article 19 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, as well as the International Covenant on civil and political rights. This is also in breach of the right to security and protection from ill treatment, and also we see that the abuse of extradition requests, prosecution in absentia, or legal harassments are also in breach of the due process and the fair trial rights. And last but not least, when there are forcible return of journalists to their home countries where they face repression, this is in clear breach of the principle of non-refoulement and the other obligation towards refugees and asylum seekers. So in the face of that growing trend, and this is, I would say, a positive note, we see that there is a growing also international recognition of this phenomenon. In 2023, during the Summit for Democracy, we see that several states, including Germany, Chile, Estonia, Kosovo, Latvia, Lithuania, the Slovak Republic, and at the time the USA, issued a declaration of principles to combat transnational repression. Last year, in 2025, the G7 also issued a strong declaration to condemn transnational repression. We heard about what OSCE is doing regarding transnational repression, but OSCE is not the only organ in Europe tackling that issue. I will mention also the June 2023 resolution adopted by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe condemning transnational repression. At the level of the EU, there is more to be done. When it comes to the international level, at the level of the United Nations, which is of first interest for the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we see, and it was mentioned by Haidar, that many special procedures are dealing in their daily work with transnational repression cases. Just to mention the Committee of Enforced Disappearance, which found that Turkey abducted a number of journalists abroad, but this is not the only case. There are many cases related to Iran, Russia, indeed, and other countries that are engaged in transnational repression. It was mentioned by Haidar in 2024, the Special Rapporteur, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression, published quite a pivotal, I would say, report on journalists in exile, with a whole chapter dedicated to transnational repression and examining the various phases of transnational repression, from physical assaults to online violence to legal harassments, but also what she calls the repression by proxy, targeting family members, which is very, very important. Anyway, in 2022, she had already published a report when she identified all those threats that journalists in exile and abroad face. But more importantly, last year in June, during the Human Rights Council session in June, there were two resolutions adopted, one on the safety of journalists and another one on civil society space, that even though they do not mention transnational repression as such, but they clearly identified all the abuses that could be encompassed by transnational repression. So this is, I think, also important steps. Last year also, we saw a new resolution adopted by the General Assembly on the safety of journalists, which, I quote, condemns extraterritorial targeting of journalists, including harassment, surveillance, and killing. So again, transnational repression is not quoted as such, but clearly all the threats that are covered by transnational repression are there. So this is a step. But despite that step, we see that there are still gaps remaining. The main one is clearly political, because we see still a number of states that do not want to formally recognize TNR at the international level as a distinct human rights issue. We see also that more at the practical level, that the fear of reprisal, as well as the lack of safe reporting channels and the low awareness, lead to many undocumented cases of transnational repression, and no measures being taken to support those victims of transnational repression. There is also a lack of capacity. We see that authorities, but also all those involved and facing transnational repression, lack tools and training to first identify transnational repression and to respond correctly to that new phenomenon. And then we see also that the support in many cases consists in emergency response, but this is not sufficient. In the workshop that IPHR organized last December in Brussels, it was mentioned that there is also a need for psychosocial support for victims of transnational repression, in addition to livelihood assistance and mobility pathways for those at risk. So OICHR has done quite a lot of work to raise awareness on transnational repression at the international level, especially at the level, as I mentioned, of the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. We have organized workshops. We have organized last year a side event during the June session of the Human Rights Council, where we launched our briefer on transnational repressions that you can find on our webpage, OICHR webpage on Civic Space. But we have now received also some funding from the German government to conduct a broader project, which will be built under two pillars. The first one will consist in increasing the documentation of transnational repression cases by mapping existing transnational repression database and working toward a common data model for more systematic documentation and reporting on transnational repression. We will try also to give more visibility to some TNR cases. And the second pillar is to identify more practical solutions. So we will try to build more community of practice. We have already a community of practice at international level, but we will try to replicate that more at regional level. There is one community of practice which is being developed and will be set at the European level. And we will continue to organize a workshop at the international level and regional level to share good practices and to strengthen coordination in order to tackle this very challenging phenomenon. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Renaud. As a beneficiary of some of the work that your office has been doing on TNR, I can say that it's extremely useful and you need to keep it going. I think what I would like to, one observation I would like to make is that, you know, much of the policy response obviously needs to be done on the national level, at the member states level, but transnational repression as a phenomenon is transnational in its nature. So it is absolutely necessary also to have some of the policy responses that are transnational in nature, and that's why, you know, UN, OSCE, and other institutions play a very important role in tackling this problem systematically. Maybe one initiative I would like to mention that some of the organizations that are present here at the forum have undertaken starting last fall is the campaign for the dedicated Council of Europe Treaty Convention on addressing transnational repression. There is a growing number of organizations that support this initiative, and it's really about creating a legally binding international instrument which will, among others, define the transnational repression, but also impose certain positive obligations on the states with the purpose of preventing transnational repression from taking place. Because, you know, unfortunately, you know, by the time cases go to the European courts, and by the time judgments come out after 10 years, it's too late. And this cannot be perceived as an adequate response. Luckily, there is a growing number of Council of Europe member states which are supporting this initiative, so hopefully we will see the treaty soon. But there is obviously a process. Our last intervention is from the audience, from Izzy Katz, from the Foreign Policy Center. Izzy will talk a little bit about the work that UK TNR Coalition is undertaking. Over to you, Izzy.
Thanks, Simon. Morning, everyone. My name is Izzy Katz. I'm the Policy and Parliamentary Affairs Manager at the Foreign Policy Centre, and I also chair the steering group of the Tackling TNR in the UK Working Group. I'd like to start by thanking the panellists for sharing their lived experience with us and the very important work they're doing to highlight the risk of TNR faced by journalists around the world. It's hard to know the true scale of TNR in the UK, but there have been several causes for concern in recent years. Since 2022, we know MI5 has responded to at least 20 Tehran-backed plots against UK-based individuals. 3 unofficial Chinese police service stations have been exposed in the UK, reportedly being used to harass individuals from China now living here. Hong Kong authorities have issued bounties on at least 10 individuals in the UK. And in May 2024, the Metropolitan Police charged 3 men with surveilling Hong Kong pro-democracy activists. Since the National Security Act came into force in December 2023, at least 6 of the individuals charged under it have been connected to TNR. So in response to these concerns, in September 2024, alongside the Richardson Institute, the FPC formed the Tackling TNR in the UK Working Group with 3 objectives: to advance research and monitor incidents and effects of TNR in the UK, to support individuals and groups affected by TNR, and to identify and shape the development of a comprehensive policy response. Today, we're a coalition of over 60 organisations and individual members, many of whom experience TNR on a daily basis. Our primary objective was to secure parliamentary inquiry. So when the Joint Committee on Human Rights announced their inquiry in January 2025, we were very pleased our experts were invited to participate. The committee's report gave important recognition to the scale of TNR, the chilling effect that it has, and the need for a robust and urgent government response that TNR-targeted individuals and communities play a prominent role in developing. Several of our recommendations were incorporated in the committee's recommendations, including on greater cross-government and interagency coordination, an accessible hotline for TNR targets, mandatory police training, and adopting a definition. However, when the government response was published in October, only a small amount of the inquiry's recommendations were adopted. We welcome the government's commitments to improve police training and data collection, but we felt the response did not reflect the reality TNR targets face in the UK. And this is why we've put connecting TNR targets with policymakers at the centre of the next phase of our work. We've been collecting testimonies from across different communities and professions, which we will be publishing on our new website, launching soon. We will also be launching our policy paper in Parliament in April and bringing TNR targets to talk to parliamentarians about their experiences that influenced our recommendations. We advocate for a 4-part approach: monitor, respond, support, prevent. As a first step, we're asking for structured engagement with affected communities and civil society, improved reporting mechanisms and support services, strengthened police training, the adoption of international best practices, and for the government to adopt our definition. We are fortunate in the UK that TNR is an issue with cross-party support. In the last few months, we have seen some positive changes in our discussions with the government. We're hopeful that we can continue to work closely with civil servants, parliamentarians and ministers to ensure that policy is underpinned by proper community engagement and best practice. Following growing international interest, the Tackling TNR in Europe Working Group was created in July 2025 to improve coordination and information sharing. It's an informal coalition of individuals and organisations from around the world, all working on strengthening the response to TNR within international organisations based in Europe, including IPHR's important call for a convention at the Council of Europe. We're working closely with the United Nations Regional Community of Practice for Protecting Human Rights Defenders, and in December we were invited to the European Parliament. So if you're interested in learning more about either of these organisations, we are working on TNR. We have a stall at the fair this evening, so you can come along and talk to us. I was going to use my privilege as a speaker to ask a question, but we are running quite a bit behind, and I think it's time for a break. So I might suggest we don't have a Q&A, but you can come and speak to our lovely panellists over the coffee break, if that's okay. Okay, give them a big round of applause.